Thank you, everybody. I'm going to read part of it and just give a talk for the rest. And I woke up this morning realizing that the last sentence in my paper contradicts the title. So basically, I want to say space is not a home, generally speaking. Nevertheless, there is a way in which a space can be made into a home. So I've got a few sentences which kind of explain the different ways in which we use the word space. A straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. Somewhere in space, there may exist worlds unknown to us. Space may be saddle-shaped. Space has a positive curvature. Mathematics should enable us to decide whether space is Euclidean or non-Euclidean. Matter is spatially extended. Bodies are in space. Out west, there are still wide open spaces. I haven't enough space for my books. I haven't enough space to put my books. I have no place to go. What's a nice girl like you doing in a place like this? There's no place like home. There's a time and a place for everything. On the Ile de la Cité, one feels a tremendous sense of place. So it's just a kind of potpourri of the different kinds of ways we talk about space. Now, definitions that have been used: space is an entity, space is unreal, space is an intuition, space is a relation, space is a convention. So that's just the problem. How do we make sense of all this? And so what I want to do is explain the classical problem in terms of Newton and Leibniz, and then show how close Shantaracita is to these kinds of concerns, and what his solution is in relation to, in Leibniz in particular, and then go on to say a few things about modern views, and then make a connection between this and the Tantra in the Vajrayana and their very, very special use of space, which I'll argue is really close to the idea of place. So just to begin, Shantarakshita would agree with Wittgenstein when he advises to look, not think. In the light of our history of space, his words convey an important message. For when philosophers begin to think about space, that is, to define it, they tend to fall either into self-contradiction or excessive abstraction and consequent violation of common sense and ordinary usage. Now, here I refer to the examples I gave, which are not meant to be exclusive or exhaustive. They are obviously not clear. Some of them are useful. Some of them, in some way or another, are meaningful. So, before Kant in the 19th century, the basic ideas about space focused, apart from Aristotle, focused on Leibniz and Newton through the intermediary of two people, Clark and Princess Caroline of Wales, who eventually married somebody named George and became Queen of England and had 13 kids. Probably didn't have much time after that to do philosophy. But she's obviously very talented and was able to understand problems like space, time, the calculus, whatever, and to act as a go-between between Leibniz and indirectly. I'm not going to go into the whole issue of who did the calculus first and then that big debate, but I did do some research, and anybody who's interested can follow up on this very easily. Leibniz was really upset. And so to prove he thought of it first, though he had published after Newton published, he showed all the different letters that he'd sent to people, all the different things he'd written before that, which talked about it. So I think probably they thought of it independently, certainly not impossible. Now, when you get to space, again, I can't simplify too much because Newton is known for believing in absolute space. However, it's brought to my attention that there's a posthumous paper of Newton's in which he argues that space is unique in being neither a relation or a substance. I haven't had time to study this, and this is a quote from the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Robert Turetti. In a posthumous paper, Newton stressed that space evades the traditional classification of entities into substances and attributes and has, quote, its own manner of existence, end of quote. Until the publication of this paper in 1962, philosophers took Newtonian space for a substance, and most of them thought this to be utterly absurd. So this is the complication, but for the purposes of this paper, I'm going to take the general view and discuss it in general about space being a substance. Now, it's a nice idea because, you think of it as a receptacle in which things are, planets are in space, etc. And of course, the problem is that if space is all pervasive, then where are you going to put the planets? There's only space. Where's the room for the planets? And plus, you have the problem of the space within a planet. On the other hand, there's a certain practical necessity, and I'm not going to go into this in detail, but there is the bucket experiment, which seems to, here we have it, an acceleration in a curve, to take Newton's example, water forced by the sides of a bucket to swirl in a circle and thus to rise up on the sides of the bucket could only have one frame of reference. For the water rising against the sides of the bucket can be understood if the water is stationary and if the universe is spinning. Such curved acceleration requires the postulation of absolute space, which makes possible fixed and unique frames of reference. Now, of course, once you get to modern views, which I'll go over briefly, all bets are off in terms of quantum mechanics and relativity theory. Leibniz has a completely different understanding of space and time. And for Leibniz, it's relational. Space is the relation between points. If two apples, space is the relation between the two apples, but to a point in the apple, obviously not the whole apple. But then that point, if it's really an indivisible point, cannot itself be in space because it has no dimension. It, in a sense, has a dimension of zero. And Leibniz says this, and that's what his monads are all about. And they are basically a point of view. They are not a thing. And so there are relations, but they're really not real. And so why do you need them at all? Well, for Leibniz, it was because of the principle of sufficient reason and his belief in God. And so if you didn't have space, there would be no reason for God to put something in one place or the other. So those are the two views there. Now I'm going to skip over to Shantarakshita. And for those of you who don't know, he was an Indian philosopher of the 8th century, famous for bringing Indian Buddhist philosophy to Tibet. And most of the parts that I quote here come from his Majjhimak Alankara Vriti. His Majjhimak Alankara, the ornament of the middle way, is super famous. It's been translated, it's been commented on. But his auto commentary hasn't been. And so Khenpo Sewang Rinpoche and a big translation committee are just, it's in press, being finally copy edited. It will be coming out very, very soon, a translation and comments, an introduction to this auto commentary. So in case you're wondering where it's coming from, that's it. And anybody is particularly anxious to see it quickly, well, just get in touch with me. So from the MAAV, it's a quote. You say space is one, but if space is related to different parts, such as trees and so forth, then what is the nature of the relationship to the singularity of these if it is related to others? Then because of the relationship of these, if space has the nature of singularity, then all of them, such as trees, will not be different. If the directions are different, then that singularity could not be related to others. Thus, if some say many different atoms are in different directions, if some of them are only circling, these are mere words that atoms are this way, because a central atom would not have the self nature of having parts. And to circle or be circled, there must be parts. And if that reminds you of Leibniz, yes. Some say the atoms do not touch, but nevertheless, there's no space in between. Therefore, they look like they're touching. But this idea is also not correct. All of these presentations are merely imagination. So basically, Shantarakshit is making the same point that if you're talking about atoms, well, you have to ask, are atoms one or many? Now, if they're many, they can be divided, and therefore they're not the indivisible parts that we're looking for. But if they're started with one. If they're one, then they're indivisible. And so they have an extension of zero. And 0 plus 0 equals 0. So no way under his analysis of matter is anything going to add up to anything. So matter, his conclusion is unreal. And implicit in this is the idea that relations between material things then also have to be unreal. Sound familiar? Again, sounding quite a bit like Leibniz. Now, just to sketch Shantara, how much time do I have left, by the way? So how am I doing here? Anyway, oh, well, just keep going.
About 8 minutes.
Oh, my.
Give or take, 8 to 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, then what I was going to do then is give a clear summary of Shantarakshita's position, but I guess that's not going to happen. Okay. Shantarakshita sides with Madhyamikas, the school that holds that all is empty of substantial existence, in viewing ultimate reality as beyond conception, and there is nothing whatever that has substantial existence. Shantarakshita is claiming that on the relative level, everything rises and falls in accordance with cause and effect. Since for him, relative reality is mental, mental events are also caused. Mental events are caused in such a way as to be earmarked as one own. When I pick up a pen, I know I am picking up the pen rather than you. Self-awareness is not the only type of earmarking that our brains do for us. We can see a pen, imagine an identical pen, dream about an identical pen, remember an identical pen, and know which is which. There are exceptions due to specific causal conditions. For example, a patient with Alzheimer's syndrome may think she is perceiving strangers in her living room when they are a product of her imagination. To conclude, according to the natural process of cause and effect, moment by moment, experiences arise, apprehended as my own, perceived as imagined, etc. Nothing of this process need entail the existing of a substantially existing self-awareness. To continue using Nagarjuna's argument, cause and effect are either the same or different. If the same, nothing new could ever happen. If different, cause and effect would be at different moments of time, and one could not bring about the other because only one indivisible moment, the present, can exist at a time. Father, the cause, and son, the result, could never meet. It follows that even if events are mental and arise as if cause on the ultimate level, mental events are ultimately beyond cause and effect. Their source is unknowable, beyond conception. One might ask why, if both matter and mind turn out to be equally unreal on the absolute level, Shantarakshita characterizes relative reality as mental and not material. Perhaps it is because atoms are imperceptible. Appearances, however, are undeniably experienced as objects of the senses. And so, on the relative level, they can be said to exist phenomenologically. Shantarakshita refused to accept anything as true on the absolute level. This level is beyond propositional knowledge, beyond words. Yet at the same time, achieving non conceptual awareness of this emptiness is the ultimate spiritual goal. Now, Leibniz thinks of relations as ideas in the mind of God. So, what about Shantarakshita? He also accepts the conventional reality of space. He does not accept God as a solution for the appearance of unreal phenomena such as space. These indeed come from mind, but not from a divine mind, nor from the imaginations of ordinary minds. Where then do they come from? Shantarakshita answers, this is Shloka 60. Then, if you think all cognitions are illusory, how is this illusion perceived? If images arise in the mind by the power of this illusion, then it is still the power of another. And so, what's the power of another? Quite simply, cause and effect. And then what follows is the problem that even in mental events in a causal sequence, Nagarjuna's argument against causality is still going to hold. But given Shantarakshita's acceptance of Nagarjuna's critique of causality on the absolute level, how can we account for the orderly arising of experiences? Shantarakshita would default to habitual patterns, but that won't cover earthquakes, karma, but what about the critique of causality? With no God to direct things, how to account for the orderly arising of experiences, like earthquakes, etc.? So where does it come from? And so what Shantarakshita says, that it comes, while on the ordinary level it's mental, ultimately it comes from something beyond conception, something beyond phenomena. So then you have, I'm not going to go over the paradoxes of time because we don't have time. But we do have an experience, a temporal experience. And then so we say, how does this come from? Where does this come from? If our every known understanding of time is fraught with paradoxes and contradictions, like to point people in the direction of Ari Bergson, for example, and problems about before and after and past, present, future. How do we fit these together? How can we speak reasonably about the source of time? Perhaps by analogy with a hypothetical construct in science. One example in physics is dark energy and dark matter, which are thought to be necessary ingredients in the orderliness and continuity of the universe. And then was put really well by Neil deGrasse Tyson. And this is his recent book on physics for ordinary folk. Quote, at the end of the tallies, visible matter alone could account for more than 5% of the critical density. How about the mysterious dark matter? They added that too. Nobody knew what it was, and we still don't know what it is, but it surely contributed to the totals. From there, we get 5 or 6 times as much dark matter as visible matter, but that's still much too little. Observers were at a loss, and the theorists answered, keep looking. Both camps were sure the other was wrong until the discovery of dark energy. That single component, when added to the ordinary matter and the ordinary energy in dark matter, raised the mass energy density of the universe to the critical level, simultaneously satisfying both the observer and theorists. So what is this stuff? Nobody knows. Yes, we're clueless. But it's not object cluelessness. Dark energy is not adrift with nary an anchor, a theory to anchor it. Dark energy inhabits one of the safest harbors we can imagine. Now, I made another point, which I'm not going to discuss now about St. Thomas Aquinas's 5 proofs and how on the third proof, necessary being, the way he presents it seems to be presented as a hypothetical construct. Now, in another talk, Karsten Struhl had mentioned that when you use hypothetical constructs in science, then they used to generate testable propositions, which is not the same with God or emptiness. But some Buddhists claim primordial wisdom is directly confirmable in enlightenment. Primordial wisdom could be understood as a hypothetical construct in Vajrayana and to some extent in all Mahayana. Primordial nature, Dharmakaya, emptiness is the foundation of the phenomenal, of time, of space, of interdependent co-origination. It is known as emptiness. Reasoning about time, space, causality, etc., shows we are clueless about the nature of these. Nevertheless, they're experiences that are more or less orderly, and we can account for them as the display of primordial wisdom. So I'm going to
2
continue.
minutes,
How much time have I got?
like 1 or 2 minutes.
Okay. So just to continue to the Vajrayana, and I just make one point about autistic children, mentioned to me by Lorraine Kovalenko. It was a book by Jennifer Cockle, that very often autistic children, they never feel at home. Everything seems strange to them. And in a way, that is in the later ideas in Vajrayana Buddhism, that's true. It's the problem why we are not enlightened, because we are not at home. We do not have a feeling of comfort and connectedness with the universe. And the idea here in the Great Perfection Tantras, when I use the word klong in a way analogous to space, I'm talking about an interesting paper by Sten Alfball. It can refer to the expensive sky. The term klong is used to describe aspects in which the individual's true nature of mind is analogous to space. Space is present everywhere. No effort is needed to reach it. It cannot be transcended. It is immense, encompassing everything. It is devoid of characteristics and cannot be apprehended without center, etc. One's perceptual world surrounding oneself as a center is therefore said to be equivalent to a mandala, effortlessly present by virtue of one's natural clarity. So, in other words, space in Vajrayana philosophy is not just a symbolic metaphor, but has transformative value. In enlightenment, it is said to be non-dual, beyond self and other, a sacred place and a true home. And I'd also just mention very briefly, and then I'll end, that David Alpert has said that that there is no way in which you can understand space or any of the basic ideas, basically in quantum mechanics or in relativity theory, without understanding them as completely inseparable from the mind. And so it's a little bit of a modern view of this. So, okay, I'll end there. And I think we might have a minute or two at time for questions. So thank you very much, everybody.
We'll wait till the end for questions for everyone, just to make sure that everyone gets their time. So we'll move on to the next speaker for now. Thank you, Marie. All right, our next speaker is John Powers.
Can I share a screen then?
Yes. Oh, let me, yeah, how do I do that? Yeah, oops. Co-host. You should be able to share now.
Okay. Can everybody see it?
Yes.
Unfortunately, I can't. Well, anyway, I think I can. I can
Oh,
read mine.
now we can see it. There we go.
Okay. All right. So anyway, my paper looks at the Buddhist idea of the problem of evil. And this started with a request to write a blurb for a book jacket. The book is called Philosophy's Big Questions, and there's a really excellent article by Amber Carpenter that discusses karma. It's probably the best piece that I've seen on the Buddhist notion of karma. And what struck me in this was she started right at the beginning by saying that Buddhism has no concept of evil. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing anything here. So you can all see my screen, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, anyway, I'll hope that it works. Anyway, so she says in this at the very beginning that there's no concept of evil. And I know that this isn't the case because the text that I worked on for my PhD, the Discourse Explaining the Thought, or Sandhi Nirmochana Sutra in Sanskrit, has one of the clearest statements of a Buddhist version of the problem of evil. And so I wrote to the editor and said, look, this really ought to be changed. And I was surprised when I got the final version of the book and it hadn't been changed. And so I started looking at secondary literature to see how widespread this idea was that there is no problem of evil in Buddhism. And I found a near unanimity in the secondary literature that basically agreed that this was the case. And I think that it traces back probably to Max Weber and his Sociology of Religion, where he discusses the problem of evil at length. And he says that the Indian philosophical treatment of the problem of evil basically took care of it. And so there was no problem of evil in India. And he thinks that Buddhism has the best version of an answer to the problem of evil. And so basically that settles it. And that seems to have been accepted by pretty much everybody looking at this. And so I was a bit surprised to see this because, again, I know that this isn't the case, and there's quite a bit of discussion of a problem of evil in Buddhist sources. It's obviously different from what you find in Western sources, but it's definitely there. So I got a lot of help from people in online discussion forums, including Marie, who suggested quite a number of sources, probably dozens and dozens of sources that all provide a Buddhist discussion of the problem of evil from different perspectives, which I boiled down into three primary trajectories. That's what we're going to be primarily talking about in this. So first of all, can everybody see the next slide here on Theodicy and Buddhaodicy?
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm not seeing the same thing as everybody else's, I think.
It could be bigger if you can make it the slideshow.
What's that?
If you put it in slideshow mode, then it will be bigger.
Oh, okay. How's that?
There you go. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So as you can see here, theodicy derives from two Greek words, theos, meaning God, and dike, justice, judgment, or trial. So it connotes, in a Western context, attempts to justify God. It only arises in a context in which you have the concept of a God who is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. And so the question then is, how can such a God create a world in which there's so much evil and suffering and so forth? And so since Buddhism doesn't have a creator God, and there are a number of Buddhist sources that deny such a being, the consensus in the secondary literature is that Buddhism has no such problem. So as I mentioned here, Weber says that Buddhism presents, quote, the most radical solution to the problem of theodicy. And Weber and other people following Weber seem to think that Buddhism has really settled the matter with its doctrines of karma and rebirth. And so they provide all the explanation that's needed for dealing with these issues. So there's no need in Buddhism to justify the Buddha, other Buddhas, or Buddhism, because they've basically taken care of this. So in the article which I circulated, and hopefully all of you received it, and if you have any feedback, I'd be very grateful to receive it, because the article's already found a home in a book that will be coming out later this year. So it'd be nice if people find problems or issues or things that I need to deal with or other sources so that I can revise it for the publication. So I found that Ricoeur's discussion of evil was particularly useful. He talks about what he calls the philosophy of fault. And as he mentions, there are two primary senses of fault in the West. One is something that's defective or flawed or imperfect, which obviously resonates with Buddhism. And there's also an act or failure to act or an attitude that is blameworthy or morally wrong. And this also has resonances, particularly with the discourse explaining the thought, as we'll see later. And he also mentions what he calls a more archaic notion, which is defilement conceived in the guise of a stain or blemish that affects from without. And this is also something that resonates with Buddhist ideas of the pervasiveness of suffering or unsatisfactoriness in the world, which I'll get to, I think, here. Okay, so terminology is important in all of this. So there are two primary terms that come up in this literature. And I should mention that I'm really only dealing with Indic sources, with texts in the Pali Canon and in Mahayana Sanskrit sources. I decided not to look at Tantric sources because it gets really complicated with that, and also not to look at East Asian sources because, again, you have a lot of different trajectories of discussion that would get very complicated if you tried to sort them all out, which I'm not going to try to do. So one of the most, well, probably the most important term in all this is the term dukkha, which exists in both Pali and in Sanskrit. And it has three primary senses in the literature. One of physical suffering is when you're hit over the head with a hammer or something like that. There's also the suffering or unsatisfactoriness of change, as when you find something that you like and then you eventually lose it, like say people or things or situations or whatever. And then the third one is what's called pervasive unsatisfactoriness, pervasive dukkha, the fact that all of cyclic existence is constituted in such a way the situations change. And so at any time, a good situation, a pleasant situation, or even a neutral situation can turn into one of suffering. And you can't predict when this is going to happen or how it's going to happen. And this, from a Buddhist perspective, is unsatisfactory. And that's the primary problematic in Buddhism in general. That is how to deal with this unsatisfactoriness. So Buddha goes to the great Pali commentator, etymologizes dukkha in two words or two particles. So there's the prefix du, which means bad, evil, or difficult, and the suffix or root word kam, which can be ness. It can also be emptiness or space. And then Monier Williams, in his Sanskrit English dictionary, says that the term dukkha combines the terms douche, bad or wrong, and ka, a hole or a space. He also says that according to the Sanskrit grammarians, it's more probable that it's that the main word here is sta, meaning abiding place or ground. So in all of these etymologies, dukkha connotes a bad situation, a negative environment, or an unsatisfactory situation. The other main term here is papa, which is often translated as sin, which is not actually a bad term. It correlates with the recursive second sense of fault, that is actions that are sinful, morally culpable, wicked, or harmful to others. The embodiment of this in the literature is Mara, who is often referred to as Mara Papiyan or Mara Papima in Pali literature, Mara the evil one. So Mara is the personification of evil, and primarily his primary role in the literature is that he tempts people into actions that are evil or sinful that lead to suffering, that lead to continued attachment to cyclic existence that so it keeps them within cyclic existence. So in looking through the literature, I found that the Pali literature is generally not concerned with the origins. So one of the famous stories in this is the story of a man who was shot by an arrow, and a doctor comes to treat him. And as he's laying there on the ground bleeding, he wants to know first who shot the arrow, where the arrow came from, what caste the man belongs to, what the arrow was made of, is it wood, what the bow was made from, and so forth. And none of this is relevant because the existential situation is that he is in the process of dying, and the doctor has the means to cure him. So all of these metaphysical questions are irrelevant to his situation right now. And that's a pervasive idea within the Pali literature. But in Mahayana, it is different because the Mahayana Buddhists are better, they have more powers, they're more expensive and so forth. So you have more accountability, I think, in the Mahayana literature. So in Mahayana sources, you really do have a problem of evil. And you have, as I said, three primary trajectories that deal with this. So I've sort of narrowed these down into what I call, first of all, the Peter Parker principle, With great power comes great responsibility. This is what you find in the Sandhi Nirmochana Sutra. And then there's the Billy Joel principle. We didn't start the fire. In other words, it's not the Buddha's fault. And then what I call the strawberry fields principle, nothing is real and nothing to get hung about. You find this in Mahayana literature in particular, and in Nagarjuna. So we'll see how this plays out. So the discourse explaining the thought, the Sandhi Nirmochana Sutra, consists of 10 chapters, and in each one, there is a 10th level or Bhumi Bodhisattva who poses questions of the Buddha relating to problems within Buddhism, particularly problems within Mahayana philosophy. So in chapter 9, Avalokiteshvara is the main interlocutor, and the chapter is concerned with bodhisattvas and with bodhisattva practice. There's extensive discussions of the bodhisattva path, of the bhumis, the stages of the path to Buddhahood, the various sorts of things that bodhisattvas do, and how they progress along the path. So there are fulsome descriptions of their great qualities, of the things they do, of the wondrous skill and means and their advanced wisdom and so forth, and how they provide various benefits unstintingly to sentient beings. And they also attain inexhaustible resources, which are given unstintingly. So at a certain point, about a third of the way through this, the obvious question arises. Avalokiteshvara asks Bhagavan, Buddha, if the resources of bodhisattvas are inexhaustible, and if they have compassion, then why are there poor people in the world? In other words, if all of the stuff you've been saying is true, then how can there be any suffering at all, given that there are innumerable bodhisattvas, they're all over the place, they're constantly working for the benefit of beings, along with all the Buddhas who are generating emanation bodies, nirmanakayas. So why is the world so screwed up? So this is the answer, and I won't read all of it, but basically it comes down to the idea that it's their karma. So he says that the problem is with the beings themselves. So the bodhisattvas and the Buddhas are doing all that they can, but their actions are blocked by the karma of the sentient beings. There's a wonderful story in the literature of the Buddha and Ananda walking along a road toward a village, and they see an old woman by the side of the road who's in obvious distress. And so Ananda says, "Oh, blessed one, you should help this woman." And the Buddha says, "I can't, there's nothing I can do for her." And he says, "Surely, the Buddha can help her out." And he says, "Well, I can't. And the reason is she doesn't have the karma to see the Buddha. So no matter what I do, nothing is going to work." And so Ananda says, "Oh, give it a try, please." And so he does, and he walks up to her and she looks away. And then, she looks up in the air, so he rises up into the air to where she's looking. And then her gaze goes downward, so he sinks into the ground to where she's looking. And wherever he goes, she looks away. And it's not that she's consciously avoiding him, it's that she just can't see the Buddha because she doesn't have the karma. So he says to Ananda, "See, there's nothing I can do. What more can I do?" And this is exactly what you find in this passage in the Sandhi Nirmochana. In other words, that the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are doing all they can, but their activities are blocked by the karma of these sentient beings that makes it impossible for them to fully access the help that's on offer. And so this is compared to pretas, or hungry spirits, and how when they get water, the water appears to them as disgusting substances like pus and blood. And so, as he says, it's not the problem of the ocean that the pretas can't access it as water. It's their own fault that create the situation in which the ocean appears this way. And so he says that the generosity of bodhisattvas is like the ocean, and the faulty actions of the sentient beings are analogized to the pretas, the hungry spirits. So in other words, it's not the Buddha's fault, it's the fault of the sentient beings. So the Buddhas are doing the best they can with what they have. It's just that their actions are thwarted by this karma. So the second strategy is, as I mentioned, the Billy Joel hypothesis. We didn't start the fire. So there's no one really to blame. Buddhism doesn't have a creator God. And the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are also not to blame because they began their careers as sentient beings. They figured things out, they got it right, they followed the path to awakening, they became Buddhas, and now they're doing the best they can, but they have no ability to abrogate the laws of karma. Karma operates as it is, the universe is what it is, and so the best that they can do is provide the help that is possible to sentient beings. So there are a number of texts that discuss the god Brahma, who is said in Vedic literature to be the creator of the universe, but in Buddhist texts, he's sort of seen as a generally benevolent deity, but one who's confused about his actual status. And so, according to this, to the story, when the universe is newly created, a Brahma, who was a sentient being who accumulated great karma in a past life, comes into being, and he's the first being. And so he looks around and he surveys the universe, and there's nobody else. And he thinks, wouldn't it be nice if there were other people, other beings? And then beings begin to appear, but it's because of their karma. But he thinks it's because of me. And so he says, I am Brahma, great Brahma, the conqueror, the unconquered, all-seeing, all-powerful, the creator of everything. And the Buddha sort of chuckles and says, well, he may think that, but that's not really the case. And so there are a number of stories in which Brahma is sort of shown to be misled about his, or overestimating his own importance. So in other words, again, there's nobody to blame, because Brahma may think he's the creator, but he isn't. Things just happen as they do. It's basically a sort of mechanistic universe that is driven by cause and effect. Okay, so did I miss something? Well, the third strategy is that it's all empty. Okay, so all right, so that everything is empty, and so it's basically an illusion. Okay, so in the Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra, the discourse spoken by Vimalakirti, there is a discussion of other Buddha lands other than the one in which we live. And so during the Shariputra hearing the wondrous aspects of these Buddha lands, starts to think, surely Shakyamuni must have been flawed, or must have had a lot of problems while he was training, because his Buddha land is so crappy. How did he make such a bad Buddha land compared to all these other really wondrous Buddha lands that are being described? And so he's told that actually the Saha world, the world in which we live, is a pure land. It's just that it reflects, the way it appears reflects the problems of the beings who inhabit it. And so then the Saha world is revealed as a pure land, and it has all of the attributes that Indians associate with a perfect landscape. And later on in the sutra, it sort of expands on this theme of emptiness. And it says that the Buddha tells Katyayana that everything is empty, all phenomena are really already in a state of peace. In other words, the way that things appear is different from the way that they actually are. And so he says that those who understand reality as it is knows that there is no problem of evil. So unsatisfactoriness, or dukkha, only has traction from the unawakened perspective. It's only because beings see things from their unawakened perspective, they see things as unsatisfactory and they suffer. If they understood the world the way it actually is, that is from the perspective of Buddhas, then they wouldn't see things that way. They see it in reality. Okay. So Nagarjuna seems to follow the same trajectory. So he says the cyclic existence has no beginning and it's not produced. He compares it to a magical illusion. And he says when a magical illusion dissolves, no one thinks that anything real has been destroyed. Nobody blames the magician for destroying the creatures that have been created. There's no idea that anything was killed or anything was harmed or anything like that. It was merely an illusion that now has been dissipated. And so there was nothing there to begin with, and there's nothing there now. So when Buddha talks about dukkha, or suffering and other such things, he's only employing conventional usage. He's not looking at this from an ultimate perspective. Chandrakirti comments that dukkha lacks arising and cessation. And he says that this is the perfect understanding of the nature of dukkha, again, of suffering and unsatisfactoriness. So there's a consensus in the literature, and I quote a number of people who say this, that basically this solves the matter, that the invoking the doctrine of emptiness negates the very idea of evil. According to Yasunaga, by transcending relative good and evil, Buddhism effectively resolves the problem of theodicy that has been the concern of Christian theologians. In other words, by recourse to the reasoning of emptiness, it shows that there is no problem to begin with, and that the Christians who were dealing with this problem, if they were to see things from the correct perspective, would realize that there is no problem there at all.
2 minutes, John.
So the, what?
2 minutes.
Okay, so the question is this really satisfactory? So I say that I think it doesn't, because the perspective is inaccessible to all but the most advanced practitioners. So for anybody else, it has to be accepted solely on faith. It effectively jettisons the Indian Buddhist reliance on empirical evidence and reasoning, the hallmarks of most of the philosophical literature. It also rejects all but one of the epistemic instruments that are used, that is perception, inference, analogy, and so forth, in favor of scriptural testimony, or verbal testimony. So it privileges testimony over all other epistemic instruments, because it says that you can only really rely on what you're told in the scriptures that make this move to emptiness. So to conclude then, karma and rebirth are not really, I think, satisfactory solutions, because they are what are called very hidden phenomena. In other words, they're only things that, they're things that cannot be validated by either perception or by reasoning. There's no inference that, there's no reasoning that establishes these. And in fact, all empirical evidence shows that every being that's ever lived has died and their corpses have decomposed. So it's, so the Buddhist solution to the problem of evil must be taken on faith alone, and this is only going to be persuasive to those who are already convinced. So my conclusion then is that none of this actually really constitutes a Buddhist solution to the problem of evil. It's only something that is faith-based and something that's going to convince people who already accept those conclusions. And that's that.
John. All right, our next speaker. Can you stop sharing?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So next we have Philippe Turenne. Do you need to share something, Philippe?
Yes, please. That would be helpful. I have
Okay.
a few slides.
Got you.
I have a few slides I'd like to show.
So you should be able to do that now.
Okay, great. So while I do that, thanks, Marie, for organizing the panel. And Ben, everybody, nice to see you. And I can't quite make out the people in the room, but anyway, greetings, wherever that is. So I'll, here we go. Is this coming? Can you see the slides?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So just to the topic is on the threefold wisdom. I'm hoping that people are somewhat familiar with that model. It's something you find in the Indian Buddhist tradition, in Tibetan tradition as well. I think in East Asia, this may not be as commonly referred to, but it's quite a basic model. And just to let you know what this project is about, I'm proposing to study that concept with the goal in mind being primarily drawing conclusions for method or methodology, especially for the study of Buddhist philosophy. I feel there are a lot of interesting dimensions when you study that concept of the threefold wisdom that can help us improve the methods we use when studying Buddhist philosophical literature using various methods. So that's my main point. So I'll make basically two claims today. I'm summarizing a longer paper. If you're interested, you can look. There's a whole issue of the journal called Religions, the Religions journal that is sort of being prepared on that topic. And so there are several papers on the same topic of the threefold wisdom. I think it's a rich topic for a philosophical discussion with Buddhist philosophy. So if you're interested in that topic, you can go check it out. My paper is also part of that issue, although I haven't finished it yet. So I'm hoping your feedback will help me complete the work of doing the final edits I'm working on now. Okay, so I'll make basically two claims. One is that the model of threefold wisdom, usually we talk about it really as a sort of description of the path of Buddhist cultivation, meditation. Scholars like Martin Adam have studied it with the question, of the relation between insight you get in meditation as opposed to rational or kind of philosophical principles. Scholars like George Dreyfus have talked about it a little bit more in the context of the practice of reading, which is the topic I want to focus on today. But I want to propose that it describes a particularly Buddhist model for a practice of reading and a sort of a set of guidelines for reading to be fruitful, so to speak. And that's what I call a practical hermeneutic. So I'll make that claim. I'll try to explain that claim first. And the second part of my presentation will be on methodological implications of those ideas. Or in other words, in simple terms, how do we change the way we read Buddhist philosophical sources based on this understanding of how those texts are considered, in the tradition? So in other words, trying to learn more about the differences between philosophical practice as performed in the Buddhist context. And if we want to enter into philosophical conversation with those sources, how we can draw some helpful conclusions regarding the way to do philosophy, and that I think creates the conditions for a much better philosophical dialogue and conversation. Okay, so that's the general point of this presentation. When the three, I think even this technology won't allow us for people in the audience to raise hands to say how familiar you are with this model. Basically, the model of threefold wisdom is I listed here. Yeah, it's the idea that the Sanskrit term used is prajna, in Tibetan shara, and it is not the prajna that you find kind of in categories like shila, samadhi, prajna, morality, concentration, and wisdom, but rather is more specifically applied to the concept of studying, especially studying scripture, which is referred to as the Shruttamayi prajna, the wisdom that of listening, so to speak, wisdom born from listening and reflection, or Chintamayi. In some sources, you'll find this translated as contemplation. I think it's not that helpful. Really, the process seems more to be about reflection, rational analysis, we can say. And cultivation, bhavnamayi prajna, or the wisdom or the insight that comes from cultivation, is the third step. Okay, so I'll talk about features of that model you find by making reference to Indian authors, especially Vasubandhu, Abhidharma Kosha, and the Bhashya, the commentary, and Kamala Shila. And we'll go into the details now, so I won't say more now. I assume people will be familiar with it. I consider myself very fortunate to have Marie, who's expert on Shantarakshita and Kamala Shila, and to have John also, who wrote about hermeneutics a long time ago in the same translation of Santin and Mochana. So I consider this fruitful conditions coming together. To begin with, I'll just bring out a few quotes from Abhidharma Kosha. All the translations I'm citing are from the English translation. Lothar Sampo, I think, is the translator. And for me, I was just looking at these sources, this sort of classical sources again on threefold wisdom, to try to go back to the beginning, because especially if you live around Buddhist institutions, Buddhist educational institutions, this is vocabulary, this is language you hear all the time. Be a scholar, practitioner, don't forget, don't only study, but reflect and apply it to your life and all of that. But sometimes you kind of lose track of where exactly those ideas come from, what they meant originally, and how they are still applied. So and here, of course, the time is short, so I'll just kind of narrow down on a few very specific points. But in the Kosha of Vasubandhu, the few interesting statements I want to mention is first, the idea of prerequisites for reading, or that you get ready to read in a certain way to make sure that your reading is fruitful and it does its job. And here Vasubandhu says cultivation is produced in the persons who are equipped with the two withdrawals. Okay, so this is the process here described is fairly standard. You see it, for example, in Pali Sutra, like the Samanya Pala. But there's this idea that before you go into the cultivation per se, you get ready by establishing a certain sort of base level of renunciation, of not being constantly disturbed by, attachment to the object of the senses and things like that, fame and all of those things. Okay, and so when we say those types of exercises are prescribed mostly for monastic people, is really one way to see that is that if you're still involved in the world with all kinds of hopes and fears, cultivation won't work very much. Okay, but here for me is significant that even the process of study, listening, reflection, and cultivation itself is considered as any kind of standard spiritual practice and should be done once the prerequisites are being fulfilled. And I'll talk later about why I think that's significant for sort of understanding of the practice or the art of reading from a Buddhist point of view. The second one is that the three wisdoms are clearly portrayed by Vasubandhu as being in progression. Okay, so it says settled in one's conduct, equipped with listening to the teachings and reflection, one will be capable of devoting oneself to cultivation. So bhavana, cultivation, and by the way, this is the word that is often translated as meditation, but really talk about cultivating certain mental qualities. We'll see in Kamala Shila is focused more on cultivating an understanding of reality itself, but it's results from listening and reflection. Okay, so especially when these days some people try to separate the idea of practice of cultivation with sort of philosophical or doctrinal things. For example, if you focus on the meditation techniques as therapy, then the scripture, the message, the teachings that are sort of behind that sort of become irrelevant. This is not the model we have here. You progress to cultivation by starting with listening and then reflection. And especially one thing that is interesting I found in Kosha is that for Vasubandhu, when he uses the term bhavana, cultivation, he explicitly names it samadhi bhavana. Okay, so it's the cultivation of samadhi. Samadhi in early Buddhist sources, it comes under many guises, but this seems to be the constant. The definition of that term is under citta ekagata in Pali, basically one-pointedness of mind. Okay, so there's the idea that the progression from listening, reflection into cultivation also has a sort of parallel dimension of going into sort of, you start with very discursive types of practices like reading and reflection into samadhi that is less so involved in juggling concepts, proofs, logical analysis, and things like that. Okay, I don't want to give the impression that samadhi, according to this model, necessarily has to be non-conceptual, non-discursive. The point here is not to draw a strict line between those practices. You'll find in a variety of Buddhist sources, some people allow much more discursive practices to be involved as part of the process of cultivation. Some schools want to say, up until reflection is all logical, rational, discursive, and then you step out of concepts, and some don't. But I don't think that really is fundamentally harmful to the general point. Okay, samadhi, whether it includes discursive practices or not, overall is focused on one-pointedness. And as we see later with Kamala Shila, there's also a sense of moving closer to reality by moving away from the mediation that takes place when you apply a lot of conceptual tools. Okay, so those are the 3 points I want to mention from Vasubandhu. As for Kamala Shila, I brought a little bit longer quotes, and I don't want to read all of them, I think, because it's boring to you, but you can look. But the main points here are that again, there's progression. Okay, you start with the wisdom of hearing. This is the translation you find in Martin Adams' thesis that translates the Bhavana Karma. So it's a bit old, but anyway, I think we get the main point. Okay, so you start with hearing, which is the same as listening. You enter into the meaning of scriptures. Then you penetrate their provisional and definitive meanings by the wisdom of thinking. So usually when we talk about Buddhist hermeneutics, we tend to focus on this section of thinking about various categories of interpretation, thinking about various level of authority, being more or less definitive. And that takes place here. What I'll propose is that the whole process is a practical hermeneutic, not only distinguishing between provisional and definitive. And finally, having ascertained the meaning that is real by means of thinking, then you cultivate it directly. Okay, not that which is unreal. So there's a sense that reflection allows you to distinguish between reality and sort of false views, and make sure your cultivation deals with the correct views, correct concepts, so eventually reach directly into reality. Okay, and just a short note in the end, for Kamalashila, the goal seems to be certainty or doubt. It has to do with doubt. So if you don't do the process properly, okay, if you meditate upon the false, and on account of the non-disappearance of doubt, there's no production of perfect knowledge. Okay, so there's an interesting picture here. The idea that perfect knowledge comes from removing doubts. Okay, it's very typical. You find that in Buddhist literature. It's very different from the way we think of philosophy in contemporary philosophy. So it's good sometimes not to just ignore those differences in philosophical practice, but to mention them. Usually the Kamalashila is often quoted in relation to the question of how do you use conceptual tools to lead to a non-conceptual understanding of reality. And the example usually mentioned is that by rubbing two sticks together, sort of eventually they catch on fire and then the sticks burn and you end up with the result you want. Yeah, the idea that you can sort of use conceptual tools to sort of find reality and sort of destroy themselves as part of the process. But this statement, I think, is as significant, the idea that you remove doubt and that allows you to cultivate it directly. And we see in later Nyingma philosophy, for example, in Nippon, this idea of niche certainty is emphasized a lot as the process of rational analysis. Okay, so it's not that like you reach reality itself, but reality is sort of there and the doubts prevent you from approaching it. So that's the goal of contemplation. Sorry, reflection. Okay. Kamalachila has another interesting quote, and this is from first Bhavana Krama, by the way. Having ascertained, the goal is unmediated, non-discursive practice. Okay, this may not be that clear in Vasubandhu. In Kamalachila, it's quite explicit. It says, having ascertained the real meaning by means of the wisdom of thinking, one should give rise to the wisdom of meditation, cultivation, in order to directly perceive it. Okay, Bhavana thus leads into a clearer perception of reality, not mediated by conceptions. That is my conclusion. The Sanskrit phrase used here is pratyakshi karanaya. Okay, pratyakshi karanaya. So direct perception. Okay, I'm happy to discuss that further if you want, especially those who have read Kamala's views on Brahmana theory. I'll discuss this in a minute. Finally, the third quote is, when the wisdom consisting in thinking as investigated by ways of both logic and scriptures, the very reality which is the natural condition of things should be cultivated. And the natural condition of things is ascertained on the basis of scripture and reasoning to be in the ultimate sense only non-origination. Okay, so here again we have an interesting statement about the process. Okay, you sort of the whole process of rational analysis, what we consider to be sort of the main work of philosophy, leads into sort of cultivation, direct cultivation, that is not done simply by ascertaining what truth is, but by sort of taking that somehow into your life, integrating into your life in various ways. Of course, the samadhi will be the main technique related to that. Okay. But again, I wanted to stress that there is, of course, the point is not to. Often people think that when you mention the fact that in Buddhist philosophy there's also a practical dimension of self-transformation, people are afraid we're giving the idea that it is not completely rational, or you can sort of solve philosophical problems by making reference to experience or mystical reality and things like that. I don't think that's what this says. The only thing it says is that the practice of rational analysis, what we consider to be at the center of philosophical practice, is part of a bigger sort of practical. Many authors mention, you read books on Buddhist philosophy. Of course, we know for Buddhist philosophy is not just about arguments, but there's a soteriological dimension. And it's very often mentioned, but what exactly the consequences are for that on the way we read and the way we use those sources is not often spelled out. So that is the project I want to use these sources to contribute to. Okay, so the methodological implications. First of all, the point of listening versus reflection. So here, whether we talk about Vasubandhu's take on this, or whether we refer to Kamalashila, this idea of the process of reading, it's interesting that those two steps are separated or in a distinct way. Okay. Now, this has implications for method for us when we study Buddhist sources, especially when we look at the academic literature on Buddhist philosophy. There is often what Matthew Kapstein calls the problems and solutions approaches. And there's sort of the idea that a good way to engage with Buddhist sources is to find common problems or similar arguments, right? And especially the idea is mentioned that we should not study Buddhist thought just simply as curators in museums, but that these ideas can be kept relevant and kept alive by engaging with them philosophically. And so therefore, scholars tend to narrow down on parts of Buddhist thought that sort of make sense in the context of contemporary philosophical problems. Okay, and of course, I don't think anybody is against that. You can disagree with particular readings, but I haven't heard anybody say don't engage philosophically with Buddhist thought, except maybe people who think that it's not philosophy or something like that. But the point for method that is interesting for me is that the Buddhist authors we mentioned, and I take them to sort of represent the general spirit of that model. You may find exceptions, but general spirit is that listening and reflection are separated. So in other words, read and listen before you start relating the text with questions that you have identified as being relevant. Okay, the whole process of this, the determining between provisional, definitive, or between which ones of those arguments we find convincing or not, is of course welcome and valid. But to what we find in some contemporary sources is rather listening through reflection. Okay, reading Buddhist texts and focusing on parts that relate to our philosophical problems, and immediately jumping into reading and sort of evaluating those solutions. So I think that's an interesting way that if we want to take, for example, the perspective of cross-cultural philosophy or doing philosophy across cultures, and we want to enter into dialogue with Buddhist sources, it's good to be aware of the fact that a Buddhist author or somebody representative of a Buddhist tradition might feel that this is not quite a legitimate way of reading those sources, to jump immediately on the places where your problems are relevant, to ignore the rest. Okay, the author and the text usually specify a practical context for their own writing, their own message, and so please study that first, and then later draw consequences about other problems you're interested in. The second one is okay. So that's the first point. The second point.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay, good. I'm almost done. The second implication is scripture. Okay, often, especially in this type of context, we feel sad that philosophers do not want to read outside of their Western tradition. And we feel that it would create more interest for Buddhist philosophy to sort of remove religious elements. But if you look at that model, scripture has a central role. I mean, philosophy basically has for its job to look critically at scripture, in a sense, you could say. So let's not forget that, and let's not erase those scriptural dimensions, and let's develop a more sophisticated understanding of how scripture is the basis for rational analysis. I think that would just lead to a kind of deeper conversation going on than just pretending that everything can be extracted from that context. Okay, and finally, I think the point that I want to do, maybe as we finish, since time is up, is the idea of a Buddhist hermeneutic or practical hermeneutic. And what I mean by that is not a theoretical hermeneutics. So in other words, these sources don't seem to be that interested in questions like, is understanding possible across time, across cultures? Can you really understand what the author says? Okay, there's a lot of those conversations we use in contemporary philosophy, and especially around the questions of objectivity, subjectivity. John, you quoted Paul Ricoeur and all those 20th century authors. What I think we can learn here is Buddhists seem to be aware somewhat of those dimensions. For example, when Vasubandhu says, if you want to understand what the text, what the author says, whether it's a scriptural statement by the Buddha or some other commentary, do the work to be able to do so. And that means prerequisites. That means listening before you come with your own questions. That means really reflecting, using commentaries, other arguments, and also it also means apply it to your life. Okay, so the model we have is, and here he uses the example of learning how to swim. Okay? If you, for example, study Buddhist philosophy, and here you see, yeah, learn how to swim kind of theoretically, you learn a little bit, and then in the end, you know how to swim without something to help you float. If you take a Buddhist perspective, and if you go and you engage philosophically with texts, but you never intend to really apply them to your life in the way the Buddhists think, as samadhi bhavana, it will be like learning, studying swimming without ever intending to actually swim, and thinking that your job of understanding those sources is complete, even though you never went to swim. And so I think it brings interesting considerations for us as we think about our methods. Okay, I think I've covered this point. Time is up, yeah, Ben? So I'll stop here and look forward to your questions and discussion.
Thanks, Philippe.
Thank you. And I'll stop the share right away. Okay, thanks everyone.
Okay, so next we have Jigme Ken Faber. Are you sharing your screen, Jigme?
No, I don't need to do that. Thank you.
Okay, no worries. All right.
So we're ready to go?
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Ben, for the introduction, and thank you for getting physically to the meeting. My intention had been to do the same, and I had made all plans to do so, but my flight got canceled, and I rescheduled my flight, and then that got canceled. I'm told the staffing problems due to COVID, with additional complications for the weather. So nice job getting there, Ben, and making it possible for us to have this wonderful gathering, and great to see you, Philippe. Thank you for that very nice presentation. And John, good to see you, and Marie. I would like to use my time primarily as a discussion, because I fear that we're going to get to the end and not have much time for questions. And I have a tendency to lose track of different threads of discussion anyway. So if you don't mind, I'm going to keep my introduction here relatively short, and I would like to have some input. So I see it as 11:13 now, and I figure I've got to about 11:25 or 35. Is that right, Ben?
Yeah.
And great to see you all in the audience there. I wish I could connect a little more intimately, but thank you very much for attending our session. And I'm actually very happy to see the turnout, given the small conference was going to be relatively small to begin with, a large online component, and then with all the people getting canceled, you guys, I'm happy to see you here. So thank you. And so please, you all feel free to ask questions too in just a couple minutes. So my essay is entitled "The Ground of Being According to Dzogchen." And so I'll begin by reading just a very short written introduction. Noteworthy it is that anything exists at all. Noteworthy, some say astonishing, even though many take existence as a matter of course. But the force of the question of why there is something rather than nothing depends not upon the vagaries of individual response. If there were a basis for reality that was, in some sense, self-explanatory, this would resolve or at least reduce the mystery of existence. A familiar approach in Western theology is to explain the existence of the world of our experience, seemingly contingent, as the creation of a necessary being, God. The existence of God, in turn, is said to be self-explanatory. God is said to be necessary through God's old nature and thus self-grounded. Similarly, in Dzogchen, there is the notion of the ground of being, or in Tibetan, Zi. And a distinction is sometimes drawn between the ground and the manifestation of the ground. But it is also said that the ground is not ultimately distinct from its own manifestation. One way of interpreting this is to say that the totality of existence is its own ground. The ground of being is said to be primordially pure, in Tibetan Kadak, and spontaneously present, Tibetan Lundrup. The sense of spontaneous in play here is not that of arising for no reason, but rather existing with no external reason or cause, that is, independently. And we could compare that in Western philosophy and theology with the notion of aseity in the Latin. We explore this account of the basis of reality drawn principally from Longchenpa and Dujam Lingpa. So that's my brief written introduction. I'll say a few words more general, and then I would very much appreciate your input and questions as I'm continuing to develop these ideas, and would like to hear what y'all have to say. So I can divide this into two parts. First, a general statement of this so-called problem of existence or mystery of existence, sometimes called the ultimate why question. And the second part being then insights in Dzogchen towards resolving that problem or that mystery. So first, with respect to the first, we've heard several invocations of Leibniz already, and so I will mention his name again as a person often associated with this problem, so much so it's sometimes called Leibniz's problem. It is the question of why is there something rather than nothing? Why does anything exist at all, rather than the absolute vacuity that we might imagine in its place? And in this sense, the emptiness we're talking about is not shunyata. It is just a complete absence of anything whatsoever. Some would say that would be the more expected condition. Of course, you can't have any expectation unless there's already existence. But as Leibniz himself expressed in one of his classical sources for this discussion, he said, nothing is easier and simpler than something. It seems like there being something is more the thing that would need to be explained than if there were nothing. Of course, it's a weird thing to say, because if there were nothing, then there'd be no one to ask the question to begin with. But it is a bit of a puzzle. And in fact, Leibniz's famous principle of sufficient reason comes up in this connection, because he says, given the principle of sufficient reason, first question we have the right to ask is, why is there something rather than nothing? So again, Leibniz was the one who explicitly formulated it in that manner of expression, but the issue has roots going back to ancient philosophy in the Western tradition. And of course, Heidegger has a famous discussion of it, in which he doesn't so much attempt to answer it as just note the profundity of the question itself. And I think that the contemplation of the question is valuable. For one thing, it can promote in us on a practical level a certain kind of awe and recognition of the mystery and majesty of existence. But I think from a philosophical point, it's a good beginning, because if we can come to a way of answering, or at least deepening our understanding of the mystery of existence, that will give some insight as to the nature of reality. Or as I put it, if we can understand the basis of reality, why the universe exists, that already moves us in the direction of a deepened understanding of the nature of reality. And why is that? Well, reality has to be a certain kind of way in order for it to be here, in order for it to be self-sustaining. So I could say more, of course. It goes on and on, but I will leave it at that. It's my plan to save a lot of time for discussion. And so then how about Asian philosophy generally and Buddhism in particular, and Vajrayana more particularly yet, and then most particularly the Dzogchen? What insight might we gain there? And the question doesn't seem to be raised explicitly in the Asian tradition. We can go clear back to early sources, the hymn of creation and others, where it's suggested that even God or the gods would know why reality was here. So it's not as though this notion isn't altogether alien, but it isn't raised in quite the explicit sense as we see it in Leibniz. But I do think we find resources for considering it in Buddhism, and most particularly Dzogchen. And I have to be careful in my discussion of Dzogchen because, as you all know, traditionally these were secret teachings reserved for the initiated. It was considered even potentially dangerous to be introduced too soon. So I will be talking at a general level and in a way that is publicly available now, and in a way also that my teachers have said that it is perfectly fine to do. As Philippe and others have pointed out, the philosophical discussion of these things is really quite useful, and ways of deepening and continuing the tradition. So in Dzogchen, there is this notion of the ground of being, or in Tibetan, Z. And it's a little bit ambiguous because when we're trying to speak of the nature of reality, if we're really trying to get at its ultimate nature, it's beyond expression. But nonetheless, we can gain some insight through rational discourse, and further insight through immediate recognition. One good source of this is a work attributed the Garib Dorje, said to be the first human teacher in our realm of the Dzogchen tradition, and it's the so-called 3 words that strike the crucial point. It's actually 3 short statements, and it was elaborated in the 19th century by Paltra Rinpoche, who then in turn did an auto commentary on it. And then there's been a commentary on the auto karmi by Dalai Lama, and the Khenchen Palden Sera Rinpoche, Khenpen Sewan Dago Rinpoche, and others. The first statement being direct introduction to reality just as it is. Often it's said that the Lama or the teacher is an important component to that. So that's the first thing. The second is see this reality directly and recognize it for what it is, and that there's nothing further from that to search. And finally, confidence directly in the liberation of arising thoughts. So there's this idea that in a way we can see reality directly, we just obscure it. And reality directly is the ground of being. It turns out that the ground of being is just, as was mentioned, the word primordial wisdom when Marie talked, or Yeshe, sometimes translated in different ways. So I'll read a couple quotes from Longchenpa here, and this is particularly from his The Way of Abiding, as translated by Richard Barron in the translation group under Chodron Toku Rinpoche. So the first one is, the ground of being and the mode by which it arises as apparent phenomena are by nature beyond being identical or separate. And our time, okay, so let me stop right there. So beyond being identical or separate. So that is connected with the famous tetralemma, or the fourfold negation, but further elaborated in Dzogchen in what are called the 8 extremes of conceptual elaboration. This idea that these definitive statements that aren't applicable either in affirmation or negation. So is the ground of being and its manifestation the same or different? Well, if we look at it in terms of Western theology, yes, most decidedly so. And in some of the talk in Dzogchen, it's spoken of a different, but you can't really say it's altogether different. Nor can you say that the ground and the manifestation are identical. And so we would conclude then that the distinction between the ground and the manifestation of the ground is a qualified one. Again, in connection with this question, why is there something rather than nothing? The ground would explain why there's something rather than nothing. Just as Leibniz thought the existence of a necessary God answered the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there a world? Because God created it. Why is there God? Because God is a necessary being. So then carrying on again with the Dzogchen tradition, in a way, there's an asymmetry of dependence between the ground and the manifestation of the ground. Insofar as the ground is independent of its own manifestation, but the manifestation is dependent upon its ground. But from the standpoint of ultimate truth, since all is eternal, both the ground and its own manifestation, there is no time when the ground exists without its manifestation. This issue comes up in Western theology too, but at least a common view is that God existed antecedent temporally to the creation, and then on some fine day decided to create the world, and hence the joke that we see in Augustine, where it's asked, why did God wait so long to create the world, and what was he doing before that? And the answer was he was creating hells for people who asked difficult questions. Well, I think in Dzogchen we find a better answer. They're co-eternal in a sense, even though there might be this asymmetry of dependence. I promised to keep a little time, so let me wrap this up quickly. I'll give a couple more quotes from Longchenpa, Way of Abiding. He says, although awareness creates everything, this awareness is unique in not being created by anything, abiding timelessly as spontaneously present. So in here, awareness is a translation of Rigpa, which is very much akin to Yeshe, maybe some slight differences in connotation, but the idea that the basis of all is mind. And again, this notion spontaneous presence is quite key. That's a Lundrup again in the Tibetan. The idea not that it just suddenly pops into existence, as some people disparagingly speak of the spontaneous view of arising, but rather that it's its own ground. It doesn't depend on something else as its ground. And then finally, since the entire world is encompassed within awareness, phenomena are none other than awareness, awakened mind. So then, in short, what is the answer to why is there something rather than nothing? The answer is that mind is the basis of phenomenon, and that mind is self-existence. It is its own basis. It's spontaneously present in the sense of eternal and independent. And with that, I'll stop. And it looks like I've saved myself at least 5 minutes. If I could have some questions or comments, I would be grateful.
Yeah, so I'll remove the spotlight here. And so anyone on the Zoom, like, feel free to just jump in. And that really, there's so few of us here that anyone who wants to speak can just go ahead and do so. I have a thought. Hey, for a second. It just strikes me as really interesting in hearing about this, the similarities between the Dzogchen view and like the Buddhist view in general about these things, and Aristotle, right? Like the prime mover is supposed to be an intelligence, right? It just is a thinking sort of thing. And how does it cause everything else? Well, it does so by thinking about itself, right? And it also, right, is uncaused, So it depends on nothing else for its existence. It's like, it's the same view pretty much, which is interesting from a historical perspective, right? Like whether there was any direction of influence there possibly, or anything like that. So,
That's interesting, and thank you for bringing that up to our attention. I appreciate that, Ben. And I don't have too long to respond, but I will say I definitely see at least some parallels there. Whether, you know, it's one of the controversies of Aristotle interpretation, to what extent is that prime mover God, and some think that later
Sure.
medieval tradition turn it too much into the Western theological God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, but certainly in terms of God in the sense of the basis of reality, most definitely. So thank you for that. By the way, it's nice to see you all out in the audience with finally got the screen showing you all there. So I see the masks and all, you all having a good conference despite all the stuff going on.
yeah. All right, well, if anyone has any more questions, you know, maybe there'll be some more time. I'll share my email address so you can get in touch with me, and I'll put you in touch with everybody else. And I can send you a copy of the video too, if you want that. So I'm gonna read my paper now, which is very much just the beginning of thinking about these kinds of things. So I would also appreciate a lot of feedback. Okay, cool. So I'm talking about reincarnation and panpsychism. I read a version of this paper a few years ago. But I'm reconsidering it in light of an article by Douglas Duckworth, who's familiar to this group. So, but I'm really just starting to think about his idea of relational panpsychism, which he interprets as a potential, he presents as a potential interpretation of Yogacara philosophy, but I think also sounds like it could be applied as well to Vajrayana Buddhism, to Shankaracharya. Wonder what really. So, okay, cool. So the Yogacara school of Buddhism, exemplified by philosophers such as Dinyaga and his commentator Dharmakirti, is typically identified with the subjective idealist views of Western philosophers such as George Berkeley. However, as Duckworth argues, Yogacara philosophy may be alternatively reconstructed as a version of panpsychism. So Duckworth discusses three main varieties of panpsychism. The first, animistic version, ascribes mental qualities to all objects in reality, including subatomic particles. So that everything, the simplest particles that exist, whether they're atomistic or not, have mental qualities in addition to physical qualities. So in addition to mass, density, charge, the things that would be described by physics, they also have some kind of experiential or mental or phenomenal qualities, though not of the sort that we have as sentient beings, but some sort of like proto version or more simple version, simple components. So I also call this either an animistic version, in the idea that everything has mental qualities, or like a decompositional kind of panpsychism. Psychological properties decomposed into kind of simple mental properties. Simple. Okay. A second version is, as Duckworth puts it, equivalent to absolute idealism, according to which everything is mental because only one thing genuinely or fundamentally exists, and that is a single mind or consciousness. And this sounds a bit like some of the views that have already been discussed here: primordial wisdom, this ground of being that Jigme was just discussing. But the third, relational panpsychism, holds that subjective and objective aspects of reality are inextricably interrelated in such a way that even a conceptual distinction between them is untenable. This is how I read Duckworth's conception here of the relational panpsychism. It is this latter version that Duckworth seems interested in reading Buddhism as potentially embodied. On Arnold's 2008 reading, Dharmakirti, for example, who is concerned with defending the Buddhist claim that he cultivated his great compassion over the course of many lifetimes, uses idealist premises to defend the doctrine of Punarbhava, rebirth or reincarnation, against objections from the materialists, the Charvakas. Here I developed Duckworth's suggestion that the interpretation as of relational panpsychism does greater justice to the Buddhist conception of reality than do the idealist readings, and conclude with a sketch of an argument that the relational panpsychist interpretation of Yogacara provides the same kind of ontological support for reincarnation that Dharmakirti or that Arnold thinks the idealist reading of Dharmakirti does. So, according to Hayes, 1993, the materialist Charvakas denied the possibility of reincarnation because they held the view that consciousness and other mental states are nothing more than byproducts of physical processes. So this seems more or less equivalent to the contemporary Western doctrine of emergentist, non-reductive materialism or property dualism. So probably the most popular view among contemporary philosophers of mind, most popular kind of view, which holds that mental properties emerge from and supervene on suitably complex physical properties of objects. The Charvakas are considered materialists because for them matter is fundamental, but their materialism is of a non-reductive sort because they don't identify mental properties with physical ones. If one holds such a view, assuming that the mental properties not only result from physical processes but must be maintained by them, then as the Charvakas argue, nothing about one's mental nature can survive the death of one's body. Since mental events are dependent upon the healthy functioning of the physical body, when the physical body ceases to function as a living organism, all mental events come to an end, then all psychological qualities come to an end. Therefore, it is impossible for the merit accrued during the lifetime of one body, or the wisdom and compassion that the mind cultivates in one body, to become part of the mentality of a mind residing in a different body. Dharmakirti, on the other hand, holds that both the mind and body result from a common previous cause. So he says the coincidence of body and consciousness is due to their having the same cause, like the physical senses and like color and flavor. Arnold suggests that in the end, Dharmakirti is best thought of as an idealist, denying the genuine reality of the physical or demoting it to the status of emergent, supervenient, or epiphenomenal in the way that the materialists demote the mental. So that Dharmakirti's common previous cause, karma, would always itself be mental. Dharmakirti further holds that the series of mental causes is eternal, so that the effects of an individual's mental processes continue on after the individual's body has ceased to exist. Hence, psychological attributes one has accrued during the life of one's body, such as wisdom, compassion, etc., can be passed on to the life of a future body, along with the karmic merit or debt those qualities entail, because psychological qualities in one moment causally affect those in the next. Dharmakirti is a reductionist about persons, though he is a non-reductionist with idealist leanings about the mental and physical. There is no irreducible self that persists after death, but only a continuous series of momentary mental events. The Buddhist conception of reincarnation is not of a substantial self, on this view, surviving the death of the body and then reoccurring in another, but rather is a series of momentary mental events or characteristics continuing after the death of one body into the life of another, not by persistence, but by cause and effect. So it's not the literal rebirth of the same person, it's that somehow the psychological qualities and karmic qualities of one person continue on in a new person. So it's really the rebirth of those properties, not of a substantial self. Crucial to Dharmakirti's defense of reincarnation is the view that mentality cannot depend on material causes. It is not the case that inhalation, exhalation, sensation, and thought arise independently of causes of the same kind from the body alone, since there are absurd consequences given the assumption of such arising. The primary absurd consequence appears to be that one sort of thing would then be the effect of a cause with a fundamentally different nature. The argument might be stated as follows. Nothing can come from something that has a different fundamental nature. Matter has a fundamentally non-mental nature, therefore mental properties cannot come from matter. This argument mirrors panpsychist arguments against the emergence of mental properties from physical ones. Contemporary panpsychists, such as Galen Strawson, argue against the emergence of the mental from fundamentally non-mental matter in just the way Dharmakirti does. They hold that crude, simple matter must fundamentally have crude, simple mental or experiential properties in addition to physical ones, the ones recognized by fundamental physics. So Strawson explains emergentism, the view he opposes, as follows. Experiential phenomena are emergent phenomena. Conscious properties, experience properties, or emergent properties of wholly and utterly non-conscious, non-experiential phenomena. Physical stuff in itself, in its basic nature, is indeed a wholly non-conscious, non-experiential phenomenon. Nevertheless, when parts of it combine in certain ways, experiential phenomena emerge. Ultimates in themselves are wholly non-conscious, non-experiential phenomena. Nevertheless, when they combine in certain ways, experiential phenomena. Such a view, according to Strawson, is incoherent. It gets its apparent coherence from comparison with examples of emergent properties in the sciences, such as getting from hydrogen and oxygen to the property of liquidity, and the formation of Baynard convection cells in heated viscous oil. But we cannot understand the emergence of the experiential from the physical through these comparisons because the terms involved in the reductions in the sciences are conceptually homogeneous, whereas mental and physical terms form a conceptually heterogeneous class. Mandic, 2013, calls this the nothing from nothing argument and states it as follows. According to emergentists, each particle in your brain individually lacks consciousness or mentality. However, by being arranged in a special way, those particles thereby give rise to your conscious mind, to your consciousness or mind. But isn't this then a case of something, your consciousness, coming out of nothing? Duckworth argues that Yogacara philosophers such as Dinyaga and Dharmakirti are actually best thought of as advancing versions of panpsychism rather than idealism. This would apparently be to their benefit, for Dharmakirti's view, construed as idealist, seems also to fall prey to the nothing from nothing argument, for it appears to imply that material effects emerge from mental causes. So if the underlying ground of everything is mental, but we still end up getting material things arising from it, you have the same nothing from nothing. However, by panpsychism, Duckworth, so if panpsychism would avoid this, but by panpsychism, Duckworth does not have in mind what he calls animistic panpsychism, according to which everything in reality, including electrons, admits of mental or experiential properties. On that view, just like macro-physical objects are decomposable into micro-physical objects, experiences are decomposable into micro-experiences, or more precisely, macro-experiential properties are decomposable into micro-experiential properties of ultimate particles, which have micro-physical properties as well as micro-experiential ones. According to panpsychists, there is only one kind of fundamental or ultimate particle, and every one of these possesses both microphysical and micro-experiential properties. But Dharmakirti seems to deny explicitly that all phenomena must have mental properties. According to one of his commentators, he argues as follows. If one assumes that respiration or perception or cognition and so forth arise only from the material elements, then these sentient phenomena could arise from anything. Hence, the whole world would consist of sentient beings. According to this line of thought, if the mental could emerge from the material alone, all matter should have mental properties. But Dharmakirti denies this, so it seems to explicitly rule out the reading of him as an animistic panpsychist, for he denies exactly what the animistic panpsychist claims, that all matter does have mental or experiential properties. Furthermore, the animistic version of panpsychism would commit the same error that Duckworth attributes to both physicalism and idealism, which is that they are dualistic in disguise. By claiming that all of reality is either physical or mental, one implicitly commits to a fundamental distinction between the two categories. In other words, if one claims that everything is physical substance and there is no mental substance, or everything is mental substance and there is no physical substance, one is tacitly recognizing a conceptual distinction between the two. And that's the same for properties. So one that Duckworth finds untenable given the Buddhist precept that mental and physical phenomena, subject and object, are inextricably interrelated, even at the level of conception. Duckworth can suggest that we can construe Dharmakirti's common cause as neither mental nor physical, making his view a kind of neutral monism akin to Spinoza's view that there is a single underlying infinite substance of reality, God, which admits of mental, physical, and other myriad qualities. While Dharmakirti and his predecessor Dinyaga don't admit of an infinite substance, a God, they do have in common with Spinoza the view that the dualism of subject and object, or of mind and matter, are somehow illusion. As Duckworth puts it, in his Pramana Viniskava, Dharmakirti claimed that what is experienced by cognition is not different from it. Self-awareness in this case is thus both the means and content of knowledge, similar to Spinoza's notion of substance, which he defined as what is in itself and is conceived through itself. Spinoza also supported the case that subjects and objects only appear to be distinct, but in fact are not, by following the principle that unlike things cannot be causally related, like Dharmakirti. Yogacara philosophers then posit a foundational consciousness, which, although nominally mental, is like Spinoza's substance, the source of not only of the subjective representations of mind, but also of objective representations of bodies, environments, and materials as well. Thus, the function of the foundational consciousness, or primordial wisdom, supports a form of panpsychism, that all is mind or mind-alike, or at least a weak form of panpsychism, that all is mind-dependent. That's a quote from Duckworth. This leaves the Yogacara view as somewhat ambiguous between panpsychism, absolute idealism, and neutral monism. Though Duckworth suggests that in any case, we should not understand the view as subjective idealism, because foundational consciousness is not the consciousness of a particular subject, though it is in some sense internal, in the sense that it is not out there in the external world. I'm not entirely sure what sense to make. But however, Duckworth also suggests that the principal ideas of Buddhism may be best understood in terms of relational panpsychism. The foundational consciousness of Yogacara, conceived of as a singular, non-relational or super-relational entity, appears to fall prey to the argument of Nagarjuna that there is nothing really singular because nothing exists independently. There is only ever a relational presentation of the world. Nothing can be found that is truly singular because everything is dependent on something else. So that would rule out the idea of this singular foundational consciousness as sort of a unitary substance or entity. Rather, the correct Buddhist conception of reality is that it has a relational structure, the matrix of dependent arising. According to Duckworth, within this structure, mind is a necessary component, though not necessarily a sufficient one. Just as observation is, on some interpretations of quantum mechanics, necessary for the collapse of the quantum superposition of the wave function without being sufficient for it. On this view, there is no justification, or put more strongly, no sense to be made of a reality independent of experience. Though that is not to say that experience is all there is to reality, that reality is entirely subjective, only that it has a fundamentally subjective aspect. So where does this leave us with respect to reincarnation? On an animistic or decompositional panpsychism, one can say that when a person's body dies, the body decomposes into more basic particles, which disperse into the earth, air, and water. If panpsychism is true, then those particles will have micro-experiential properties, the building blocks of the dead person's macro-experiential states, their memories, beliefs, desires, wisdom, compassion, etc. These fundamental bits will go on to be parts of new objects, including some new people. In this way, the series of mental causes that form the psychological life of a person will continue on in myriad other persons and objects. The Buddha, therefore, could possess the merit accumulated from numerous lifetimes, though again, they would not strictly speak in his lifetime. On an absolute idealist form of panpsychism, the doctrine of reincarnation seems to be trivially true. If the series of events that constitutes foundational consciousness persists eternally, then so does the merit accrued throughout that process, embodied in one then another person over time as they arise and dissipate like waves in the ocean. Relational panpsychism might retain the virtues of animistic panpsychism with respect to reincarnation without the triviality of absolute idealism. If we can understand specific psychological attributes as smaller clusters of relations within the larger relational matrix, then it might be possible for those clusters to be maintained across lifetimes. Though a body dies, some of these relational microstructures could outlive it in the same way that, according to the animistic view, subatomic particles with both mental and physical properties would persist, though without the perniciously dualistic presuppositions that animistic panpsychism entails. Thanks. Okay, I guess we're out of time. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, all of our speakers. It's great to see you all, if only virtually. And thanks for those of you in the audience.
Since this is the last session of the day, maybe we can hang out and talk for at least 5 or 10 minutes. What do y'all
Yeah, I mean,
think?
if nobody's kicking us out, yeah. I don't see anybody.
I
What's that?
know. I noticed that the
They won't
schedule
be subtle about it, right? Yeah. So yeah, sure. Yeah, Marie.
Right, yes, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. Well, I just had a small point. I mean, I just love all of you. And I just want to point to John Powers, as some others have pointed out, within the experience of enlightenment, there is a claim that's made that it is a kind of perception. And then there's an interesting way in which this kind of relates to the problem of evil. And I'd like to refer to something in a text by Sasam Lingpa. It's in a sadhana called the Iron Knot. And it's probably the only place ever where you have, refuge in bodhicitta, where the bodhicitta comes before the refuge. And the way in which he puts it is that when you have an experience, assuming one does, of primordial wisdom as compassion and emptiness, then automatically one's experience will be bodhicitta. It will be a positive, caring attitude towards everyone and everything. And then when you take refuge in order to help these beings, which he says specifically, when you see their suffering, you don't want to say they're substantially existing, yet you want to pay attention to it. And so then how do you do this? You take refuge in the illusory beings mentioned in the sadhana to which you are supposed to be taking refuge. It's a very, very interesting way to put this. And it makes a lot of sense. It's going back to a very simple point that's often used, that it's like a child who has a nightmare, and you don't go over to the child and say that the line that's attacking them is real. You try to wake them up, but you still pay attention to the fact that they're having a nightmare. So I just like to mention this in terms of the problem of evil, that in one sense, from the ultimate point of view of primordial wisdom and compassion and emptiness, everything is understood as being beyond evil, but nevertheless, that doesn't keep us from understanding that people are suffering and that we should help them.
That's really interesting. The thing that I was wrestling with in looking at this is particularly the third trajectory that I mentioned, the idea that you making the move into emptiness and non-duality solves the problem. And I don't think it does, because looking at things from the ultimate perspective is a way of an attitude that's only accessible to advanced practitioners. So it doesn't resonate with the people who you're trying to help. So it basically, the problem that I see is that it denies the lived reality of suffering. So victims of sexual abuse, people experiencing PTSD, people grappling with with bereavement, losing loved ones and so forth, simply telling them, oh, it's all in your mind, it's all, from the perspective of ultimate reality, none of this happens. That's therapeutically catastrophic, I think, completely counterproductive to simply tell people who are dealing with real trauma that looking at things from the ultimate perspective, none of this is really real. And that, I think, is the big problem with this move, is that it is speaking from a perspective that's inaccessible to the people who are really suffering. So I think that it's, at least for me, philosophically unsatisfying, but also therapeutically unsatisfying.
Oh, I absolutely agree with you, but I think that any serious Dzogchen practitioner, Buddhist practitioner, Vajrayana, whatever, would not talk like this to people. They would do exactly what you're saying. They'd say, this is your suffering, this is what I will do to help you. They would mention this, which is probably why it's called secret, because it's self-secret, it just won't work. But philosophically, may be acceptable. And just a word to Ben, just a question, real quick question, if whether or not you'd ever thought of the issue of entanglement in relation to panpsychism. And I've had this, discussion with David Albert, because entanglement is only supposed to work on the quantum level, and which he said, yes, that's true. And then I sent him 6 articles about entanglement on the macro level. And I didn't really get a reply. But there are some movements in physics about, let's say, bird migrations, that there could be some sort of entanglement. And do you think that, I don't know, maybe it might relate somewhat to the issue of panpsychism? I don't know.
I'll interject really quick on that, Marie, and I don't want to get in the way of the threat of destruction, but there's a whole new sphere of study now called quantum biology, which is talking about quantum effects at the level of organisms and ecosystems even. And so you might check that out.
What's the name of this book?
Well, I didn't name any particular book. I've seen it mainly just through some stuff on YouTube discussions, but quantum biology.
Anything you've got on it, please send it.
Okay,
to me.
We'll be talking. I'll let you know what I got. But the idea, I don't think this notion works, frankly, that there's entanglement on the quantum level, as though the quantum level is like a different sphere of reality than the macro level. I mean, if things are indeterminate at the quantum level, they're indeterminate in reality, and that permeates all the way up. And so this entanglement issue is not just a matter of microparticles. It's something that would be a pervasive aspect of reality if it's true at all.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think as it relates to like reincarnation, I guess, if there is some kind of quantum entanglement that does have macro level effects, then you could sort of understand how, so if the experiential properties of one person are capable of having effects in future people. If there's quantum entanglement, then those future people wouldn't have to be anywhere near where.
Could you say that again? I really, maybe come a little closer to the mic.
Okay. So if there is quantum entanglement that has macro level effects, then and so if we're trying to say that rebirth or reincarnation is possible in the sense that the psychological or experiential properties of one person who dies could have sort of causal effects, could have effects on future people, right? That those psychological or experiential properties could somehow continue on in a future person. Well, if there are macro level quantum entanglements, then those future people wouldn't necessarily have to be anywhere near the older people, right? There wouldn't have to be any kind of sort of direct physical contact in order for those experiential properties to have downstream effects on later people, right? So that you could have reincarnations in other parts of the world from where the previous person is, which is something that Buddhists seem to believe is possible.
Do we have any questions or comments from our audience? I'm so gratified you guys hung out with us for the full couple hours here. Anyone want to discuss anything or raise any questions? Not that I want to stop the discussion among the panel either, but just checking in with you guys. If not, I would add
I had a question I had a question also, or comment, if there's time, and if nobody in the audience, for again for John and the
We got
problem.
one. I don't know if you guys can hear him.
Oh, you got one. Okay, so please go ahead.
I was just wondering, it seems like
Yeah.
I'm thinking about this quantum indeterminacy business. Makes me very uneasy to think about.
A little closer to the mic, please.
I'm not sure where the mic is. I'm
It's
sorry.
like the computer.
The computer's not.
Right and full. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry.
You can take this.
I'm a little unsettled by the quantum indeterminacy reaching the macro level, but okay, I'm so flustered. I lost the thread of my question. I like the way it can solve this kind of like reincarnation at a distance problem that we're talking about. But I'm worried if it's true, if it like creates maybe more problems that we don't want to deal with. Particularly like the ways that I tend to think about karma are like pretty tightly tied with living in the deterministic universe. So I guess I just wanted to raise that as a worry that maybe people who have thought about this more than me.
So is the worry that if there's quantum indeterminacy, then karmic effects can be so that it would be a matter of some chance or randomness whether a good action would result in positive or negative karma.
Yes.
Yeah, that is a worry. Yeah.
But I don't know, maybe there's some good work. Like it seems to like it gives you an elegant solution to one problem.
Well, I think part of maybe the solution would be that what determines the quantum state, right, the state of a quantum particle, is supposed to be on this kind of like open interpretation that the Buddhists seem to be endorsing, or that seems to be the version that is similar to the Buddhist view, is that it's mind, right? It's you, it's consciousness that resolves. And so if it's that, then consciousness is where the karmic element is. At least on the kind of relational psychosphere that I was talking about. It's consciousness that determines both the sort of the objective state of things, but also their like karmic valence. That might help.
Well, yeah, that would be an elegant solution. Thank you. Thank you all.
I would add to our guest, have you seen William James' fine article, The Dilemma of Determinism?
I haven't, but I will look into it.
I would recommend that to you, as he puts it, taking away some of this idea of chance, and it not maybe being so problematic as its alternative, which would be a rigid causal determinism, in which case it's kind of like Laplace thought. Everything down to the last jot and tittle of everything we ever do was set and settled long before we were ever born. And I think that ends up being more problematic than the alternative in terms of the concerns you're thinking of there. I would mention one more thing, unless someone else has something that kind of ties together the thread of several of our discussions, starting with Marie and also Philippe and John and I think me and then also, as this Marie mentioned, the vast expanse, as it often gets translated, Klong. As maybe another way of understanding space and connecting with some of Ben's ideas, because it's spoken of as a single vast expanse. And in that sense, it's a monism, but it is at the same time an expanse. So it's not a simple unity. It's an expanse that allows for a certain kind of qualified plurality, and not plurality in an atomistic sense of separate independent units, independent of one another, but nonetheless a kind of diversity there. So you can't say it's a simple one, you can't say it's a simple many. At the same time, you can't say it's both, because that would be contradictory, and you can't say it's neither for the same reason. But it's both a one and a many. It's an expanse. We are, in terms of what Ben mentioned, the absolute idealism, we are in a sense one mind, but it isn't a simple unity of mind. Here we are all having nice discussion and sharing ideas from all around the planet, as it turns out. So there's a diversity there too, in the vast expanse of primordial wisdom. Does that connect with anything you were thinking on there, Marie, and your idea of space?
Yeah, of course, I agree with you. It just goes back to Shantarakshana, not one, not many, transcending both. Exactly, yes.
And the whole self-cognizing it is one thing, but it also takes itself as an object. So in that sense, it's also for them.
Who's speaking? I can't hear what was just said.
It's Ben. I'm saying it goes back to the whole self-cognizing cognition idea, right? Where it's one thing, like primordial wisdom is singular, but because it takes itself as an object, it also has to be many, right?
Right. Yeah, there's something, I don't think it's either Aristotle or Plato. We used to joke about it back in convent school when they talked about the absolute as noosing noose.
Right.
Nous.
Yeah, no, it's Aristotle. That's what the prime mover does.
Yeah.
Okay. Are we anything else, or is it time we get lunch?
Time to go to sleep.
What time is it for you there?
It's 5:09 a.m.
Oh wow! Oh
Get
yeah.
up.
Yeah. Well, extra thank you to you, John, for showing up in the middle of the night.
Be careful.
It's been great. I've enjoyed it.
Thanks so much.
Great to see y'all.